Knows the four ingredients, I hope, in beer, right? Water, barley, hops, and yeast. Water is everywhere, right? It's not like it was ever hard to find water to brew with. But the important thing, especially way back in the day, is it was healthier to drink a fermented beverage than it was to drink water in a lot of cases. Even if it was a low alcohol, old school beer that we wouldn't even consider beer by modern standards, it was still probably healthier to drink than the water that you had at disposal. There are a few kind of famous brewing waters, if you will. The most popular brewing water is called Burtonized or Burton-on-Trent water from England. It's known for having a high sulfate content and high temporary hardness. Sulfur in beers helps hops stand out. So Bass Pale Ale is actually what is the brewery in that town. It's a very bitter pale ale. The hops in that, the sulfur in that water helps dry it out a little bit. Really though, water is the most basic ingredient in beer, and I'm not going to downplay the importance of water chemistry in beer, but more or less you could take water from anywhere on earth and brew a batch of beer with it and you'd be good to go. Now barley is kind of the spirit of beer, if you will. Next to water, there's the most weight of barley used to produce beer. Barley is kind of perfect little seed for brewing. I don't know if you guys saw the barley plants in the exhibit next door. Barley has three important things going for it. One of those is that it has a high starch content, lots of carbohydrates. Secondly, it's got just enough protein in it to convert those starches into sugars. And thirdly, it has a husk. The skin of the barley kernel, if you will, plays a role as a filter during the brewing process. So those three things make barley really important. And it was kind of discovered that barley worked for brewing about 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent area, modern day Turkey, Iran, and it was kind of a happy accident. Barley is actually giving credit for hunter-gatherers switching over to an agricultural lifestyle because they could sit down and make beer to drink. And like I said earlier, beer was safer than water. And they think beer was kind of found accidentally 10 or 12,000 years ago when some hunter-gatherers collected some barley and put it in a watertight, maybe clay pot or something like that for storage. Maybe that pot had a crack in the top of it, maybe no lid, and some rainwater got in that pot. And 2 or 3 weeks later, those guys checked on their barley. Oh, hey, this is flooded with water, this is gross. And someone had the nerve to take a sip of it, and over 2 or 3 weeks, it had turned into very crude, old school beer, probably pretty sour, sourdoughy from the lactic acid and acetic acid bacteria, but nonetheless, low alcohol, lower pH, a little safer to drink, and someone was like, hey, this stuff's not half bad. If we settle down and quit hunter-gathering and wandering around, we can start growing some of this barley and start producing some of this stuff. So kind of fun, kind of exciting that brewing was kind of discovered on accident a long, long time ago. And the beer really was kind of porridge-like, almost like, they say pork chop in a can nowadays. That kind of had some truth to it back then. There were not hops used in beer at that point. It was kind of, if you even used plants other than barley, you used local herbs or something like that to give a slightly more pleasant flavor. And that was highly dependent on what area you lived in and what herbs were available to be used. But beer really went unchanged from 10 to 12,000 BC up way until, about 750 is when they said there's recorded history of the first hop gardens, not to say hop fields, but hop gardens in England and in France. And they were commonplace in the wealthy's yards. Having a hop garden in your yard was kind of a sign of being in high society. They help keep bugs down. They're a natural sedative, and they actually used to fill pillows with hops to help you sleep. So they didn't really start using hops in beer until about 850 1950 or so, they were using hops in beer in France, actually. They did it first in Germany, but they started using hops in France and England first. They actually, at one point, attempted to ban hops from beer in England around the 1530s. They thought that hops were what were making people kind of crazy from the beer. At that point, they weren't even really aware what alcohol was, so they thought the hops were like, the plant of the Diablo or whatever. Absolutely not the case. So Germany really started pushing the use of hops in beer around 1400, 1500. The noble hops, if you guys have heard of these, are all from Germany. Saaz, Spalt, Tettnang, or Hallertau. These are 4 really famous hop growing regions in Germany, and that is really the country that pushed forth, putting hops into our beer. This will bring us up to about 1500. 1500 through today is kind of the modernization of beer, if you will. They started to develop some processes that they discovered worked better. The Germans were taking and cold storing beer in barrels in caves. They found that it made the beer smoother if they stored it for a long time. They didn't know what they were doing because they hadn't discovered yeast yet, but what they were doing was putting beer into the cave at a cold temperature. Lager yeasts that were in there could live and thrive at that temperature, and other ale yeasts couldn't, so they were actually creating lager yeasts that got a little bit stronger and more pure every time they went along. So they were kind of laying the footwork for my homie Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur comes along here, my homie, yeah. In the everyone gives Louis Pasteur credit for discovering yeast. He didn't. Some guys in the 1830s were looking at yeast in microscopes, but they didn't really know what they were looking at yet. Louis Pasteur is the first guy who in 1857, 1858, something like that, was doing papers, studies on identifying yeast's role in brewing beer. Everyone used to think beer was a product of death, of cells, of decomposition. Things would decompose and break down into this product. And then Louis Pasteur came along and said, hey, this is alive. The healthier these cells are, the cleaner this final product will be. And he really started pushing forth in his studies of beer. We can all probably guess Louis Pasteur invented pasteurization for wine or milk or beer. He also identified several beer spoilage microorganisms that you do not want in beer. He also invented, for his experiments, the closed-top fermenter. Breweries traditionally use open-top fermenters. It sounds like it is. It's a fermenter with no top on it. Atmospheric air can get in there, and bacterial organisms you don't want getting in your beer can get in there. He discovered that if you have a closed container and you can sanitize it and then put beer into it, it'll stand a much better chance of not getting infected than if you ferment in open-top fermenters. So Louis Pasteur definitely paved the way, especially in regards to yeast in the 1850s. The 1850s, that brings us right into kind of when Dubuque's brewing history actually picked up. Many breweries opened in the 1850s and 60s in Dubuque. Some of them only made it 1 or 2 years, unfortunately. Many of them changed names. Fathers passed away, gave them on to their sons, so on and so on. However, about 1870 came along, and there's, all these breweries in town, all these people who had been, I got half a brewery, my brother got half a brewery. There were all these heirs to breweries. The current legislation in Iowa at the time made it very difficult to sell shares of breweries. So AE Brewing, Northern Brewing, Western Brewing, and Iowa Brewing, 4 of the big ones at the time, got together and they started to do brewing and malting. And I'm sure you guys all know the big castle down there, kitty corner from the Copper Kettle. And they did that so they could kind of buy out these shares of everyone else and start a large company in town. They actually weren't even sure if they were going to be able to sell beer or not when they opened, or just brewing materials. Turned out that they were permitted to produce alcohol once they got up and running. They could produce 300,000 barrels a year at their peak. Those numbers are staggering. Seven Hills can produce about 3,600 with our current layout. So they're much, 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 much bigger than we are down there. Unfortunately, Prohibition came through, good old 18th Amendment, closed down the Dubuque Brewing and Malting Company. It was purchased by another company out of Chicago and Milwaukee, and they intended to reopen it as a brewery. Unfortunately, that never happened after Prohibition. Now, pre-Prohibition in Iowa, there were 138 breweries. That is pretty cool. Right now, there's almost 80. That being said, after Prohibition, Star Brewery was the only brewery that came back and remained open, which is something I think for the Dubuquers to be kind of proud about. Star Brewery operated under several different names all the way up through the late 90s. Don't know if anyone in here remembers going down there or used to work there or anything like that. Absolutely. You know, then they unfortunately closed down, and we had Bricktown Brewing opened up there for a hot minute. I know a bunch of you guys probably remember Bricktown. Bricktown closed. We got Dubuque now, and we've got Catfish Charlie brewing in Dubuque, and we've got Seven Hills, and Dimensional is on the way. Exciting times for beer in Dubuque, Iowa, so we're still making that history every day, trying to do our best. And I just wanted to say thanks for having me down tonight, guys, and a great big ziggy, 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 ziggy. Thanks a lot, guys.